The 2024 Cincinnati Bengals are going to look quite a bit different from previous editions. Longtime Cincinnati Bengals Joe Mixon and Tyler Boyd are both out the door, leaving plenty of question marks in fantasy football about how to approach the Bengals backfield, who's going to be the number 3 target for Joe Burrow. And today, in episode 25 of Inside the 20 by Basement Brewed Fantasy Football, we're going to talk about them all. We're going to talk about whether or not you want to smash or pass on Jamarr Chase, T. Higgins, Jermaine Burton, Zack Moss, Chase Brown, and Mike Gesicki in 2024 fantasy football. Jamarr Chase is currently being drafted as fantasy's number 3 wide receiver. He's going pick number 4 overall, but we really don't have to spend a lot of time here, do we? It's not like you're not drafting Jamarr Chase. The guy's averaging 18 plus PPR points per game and 9 plus targets per game over 30 contests that he's played with both Joe Burrow and T. Higgins. He has a league-wrecking ceiling. He's scored 32 or more PPR points in 4 of those 30 games with T. Higgins, including a career high of 55.6 PPR points back in Week 17 of 2021. He has more games over 25 PPR points with 8 than he has games under 10 PPR points with 6. And by the way, when T. Higgins doesn't play, which happens relatively frequently over the last couple of years, Jamarr Chase absolutely wrecks and breaks fantasy football. He averages nearly 24 PPR points per game, 11 plus targets per game over 8 contests without T. Higgins, and he scored 22 or more points in 5 of the 8 games, which is about 63% that he's played without T. Higgins. He finished as fantasy's wide receiver 5 in his rookie season, 2021. He finished as fantasy's wide receiver 11 in 2022, despite playing in just 12 games. He averaged 20.2 PPR points per game, by the way, a rate that would have made him fantasy's wide receiver 3 had he played in all 17 games. And he finished as fantasy's wide receiver 11 last year in 2023, despite missing 1 game and his quarterback, Joe Burrow, missing 7. And now, heading into 2024, longtime Bengals wide receiver Tyler Boyd is gone. He moved on to Tennessee. He took 5.6 targets per game with him over the last 3 seasons. Jamarr Chase currently has the 5th best odds of leading the NFL in receiving yards. He has the 3rd best odds of winning Offensive Player of the Year. He is a top 5 wide receiver at worst, with wide receiver 1 overall upside. He is an absolute smash at his current cost. Wide receiver 3, pick 4 overall in 2024 fantasy football drafts. Number 4 overall is exactly where he's ranked in Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's 2024 draft guide. Rounding out tier 1 with CeeDee Lamb, Christian McCaffrey, and Tyreek Hill. I am actually perfectly fine. I won't argue if somebody wants to use the 1st overall pick on Jamarr Chase in 2024 fantasy football drafts. It's only a matter of time before he finishes one of these seasons as fantasy's number 1 overall wide receiver. Why not 2024? Now, what about T. Higgins? Now, on drafters.com, which is where I now play 100% of my best ball contests, Drafters, by the way, will 100% match your first deposit up to $100 if you just enter promo code BBFF when making your first deposit. But on drafters.com and on the Drafters app, T. Higgins currently is drafted as fantasy's number 31 wide receiver, around pick 43 overall, which is right in the middle of the 4th round. And the question is, do we smash or pass on T. Higgins at that cost? Over 28 games that T. Higgins has played at least 40 offensive snaps alongside both Jamarr Chase and, of course, quarterback Joe Burrow, he's doing quite all right. T. Higgins is averaging 15 PPR points and 8 targets per game over those 28 games. Of course, the trick is T. Higgins needs to be on the football field, and his quarterback, Joe Burrow, needs to be on the football field. Both of those guys have had their fair share of injuries over the last couple years. But 15 PPR points per game, that's nothing to balk at. That would have finished wide receiver 13 on a full 17-game season last year. Now, of course, T. Higgins is a bit boom or bust as an asset in fantasy football. He does score 23 or more PPR points in about 21% of his games with Joe Burrow, and that includes a career high of 43 points back in Week 16 of 2021 alongside Jamarr Chase. But while he is scoring 23 or more points in 21% of his games, he also scores fewer than 10 PPR points in about 29% of his games. So a bit boom or bust as a fantasy football asset, and that naturally makes him a bit more easier to stomach in a best ball format where you don't have to predict booms and predict busts. You don't have to set a weekly lineup. He's much more easy to stomach in that type of format than in a season-long format where you do have to set your lineups and run the risk of catching some of those subpar, sub-10-point games. Still, in his career, when he's on the same football field as Joe Burrow and Jamarr Chase, which should be the case for Week 1, 2024, T. Higgins is giving you 15 PPR points and 8 targets per game. And one thing we just talked about in Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's Discord server, our online community of sharp fantasy football brains, which, by the way, you have to join this thing if you love fantasy football. It's super cheap. It costs less than one beer per month. It costs less than one Starbucks per month at $4.99, and you gain access to hundreds of other football fans and sharp fantasy football brains dedicated to talking ball and helping each other dominate all season long. I left a link for you to join us in the show notes, but one thing we were just talking about in that Discord server yesterday is the massive week-winning upside that T. Higgins can bring to the table in the unfortunate event, that something happens to Jamarr Chase. We've already seen 14 games of T. Higgins and Joe Burrow without Jamarr Chase in T. Higgins' career, and he averaged 16-plus PPR points and 8-plus targets per game, and that's including 9 games back in 2020 when both T. Higgins and Joe Burrow were rookies in the NFL. And if you want to look a little bit more recently than that, there have been 5 games that T. Higgins has played with Joe Burrow without Jamarr Chase since 2022, and he's averaged 20 PPR points and nearly 9 targets per game in those games without Jamarr Chase. So the point is, when Jamarr Chase is on the field, T. Higgins is still getting you about 15 PPR points per game. And when he's not on the field, T. Higgins' upside goes through the roof. And we've already seen not just games, but years of success in T. Higgins' career. He was fantasy's wide receiver 24 back in 2021 despite missing 3 games. He averaged 15.6 PPR points per game, which would have been good for a wide receiver 9 finish had he just played the whole season. He was the wide receiver 19 in 2022, one of the few years that Joe Burrow has played an entire season. And then, of course, last season was a lost year in 2023. He was in and out of the lineup with injuries, but he played just 5 full games with Joe Burrow, and during that time, he averaged 12.8 PPR points per game, which would have made him fantasy's wide receiver 25 had he just survived all 17 games. So we're talking routine wide receiver 2, sometimes wide receiver 1 production for a guy who's currently being drafted as fantasy's wide receiver 31. And now moving into 2024, again, Tyler Boyd in his 5+ targets per game, that's gone. T. Higgins is tied for the 24th best odds of leading the entire NFL in receiving yards. He's playing on a franchise tag with every motivation to just ball out and cash in and get a massive contract extension, either from the Bengals or one of the other 31 teams in the NFL. If you haven't been able to guess it by now, we are happy to smash T. Higgins at his current cost of wide receiver 31 around pick 43 overall. In fact, in Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide, which again costs less than a case of beer, and it's in the show notes below, we currently have T. Higgins ranked at number 36 overall, well ahead of his 43 overall ADP. He is a boom or bust wide receiver 2 who's capable of giving you a wide receiver 1 type of week in any given week, especially if, God forbid, anything ever happened to Jamarr Chase. Now, what about the Bengals backfield? If you haven't heard, Joe Mixon and his 309 touches are gone. He's in Houston with the Texans, and if you haven't heard, that of course means you didn't listen to episode 22, and now I'm sad. But in Joe Mixon's place is Zack Moss, and of course, last year's draft pick, Chase Brown. Currently, Zack Moss is drafted as Fantasy's RB24, around pick 90 overall, which is in the middle of the 8th round. And then Chase Brown is currently being drafted as Fantasy's RB36, around pick 119, which is in the late 10th round. So how are we approaching these guys in 2024 fantasy football drafts? Do we smash or pass at those costs? Are you a software wizard? A code ninja? A forge master? Or maybe even just a mad scientist? Then come build your career ladder with Infinity Labs, an award-winning technology company, best place to work, and business of the year with best-in-class benefits and compensation. Visit i-labs.tech. That's i-labs.tech today, where you can learn more about Infinity Labs, our expanding national presence, and why the status quo has no hold on us. Now, before I dive in, I'm going to try and keep the Bengals backfield short. I've literally already talked about these guys in 2 different episodes of Inside the 20. I talked about them in episode 11. We talked about the free agency impact of Zack Moss signing with the Cincinnati Bengals. And then I talked about them again in episode 16 when I talked about NFL veterans that survived the draft and are now sitting pretty heading in to the 2024 season. But TLDR, Joe Mixon has somewhat masked how bad the Bengals have been as a rushing offense in all 5 seasons that Zack Taylor has been the team's head coach. They have finished 17th or lower in rushing attempts in all 5 seasons, and that includes 3 different campaigns where the Bengals have finished 24th or lower in the NFL in rushing attempts. They've finished 23rd or worse in rushing yards in all 5 seasons that Zack Taylor's been the team's head coach, and that includes campaigns where they finished 29th in rushing yards in 2022 and 31st in rushing yards just last year in 2023. So they've been 29th or worse in each of the last 2 years as it pertains to rushing yards compared to other NFL teams. And last but not least, they finished 19th or worse in rushing touchdowns in 4 of the 5 seasons that Zack Taylor has been the team's head coach. It doesn't necessarily feel that way because Joe Mixon himself has been successful, and that's because he's been a career workhorse with the Cincinnati Bengals, averaging over 19 touches per game, including 3+ targets per game in 69 games that he's played with Zack Taylor. He had 270 or more touches in 5 of 7 seasons with the Bengals, finishing as a top 10 running back in fantasy football in each of the last 3 seasons, including a career-high finish of RB4 back in 2021. So it certainly doesn't feel like the Bengals rushing offense hasn't been all that terrific, but that's because of Joe Mixon's success at the individual level compared to what the Bengals have done at the team level. And now Joe Mixon is gone, leaving us to guess and try and figure out what to expect from the Bengals backfield in 2024. And in 2024, like we discussed in episode 11 and in episode 16, there is not going to be a quote-unquote new Joe Mixon. Zack Moss is not Joe Mixon. Chase Brown is not Joe Mixon. Zack Moss has career highs of 210 touches, 794 rushing yards, 37 targets, 7 touchdowns, and he's never gone over 1,000 scrimmage yards in his career. Joe Mixon, on the other hand, has crushed all of those numbers in 5 of 7 seasons that he's been in the NFL. The only 2 seasons where he didn't exceed those numbers were when he was a rookie and splitting time with Giovanni Bernard, and in 2020 when he missed 10 games. Zack Moss is not Joe Mixon. And then you got Chase Brown, of course, who was last year's 5th-round pick for the Cincinnati Bengals. He actually had 9 or more touches in 4 of the last 6 games, even when Joe Mixon was fully healthy last year. He's a legitimate threat to get the ball. The Bengals want to get the ball into the hands of Chase Brown, and they brought in Zack Moss for a reason. Both guys are going to get touches in the Bengals offense, but neither one of them is going to be Joe Mixon. This is going to be a running back by committee type of approach. And that's a bit nauseating for fantasy football purposes, especially when you remember that the Cincinnati Bengals rushing attack at the team level has not been a good one in any of the 5 years that Zack Taylor has been the team's head coach, especially when you consider the lack of volume in the running game, where the Bengals have finished 17th or lower in rushing attempts in all 5 seasons, including 3 different campaigns where they finished 24th or lower in rushing attempts. In fact, over the last 3 seasons combined, Bengals running backs have averaged just 24.9 touches per game over the last 3 seasons combined. That's plenty of touches for a guy like Joe Mixon, who's going to get 19 plus per game. But in a running back by committee, that's not a lot of volume to go around. So, what exactly should we expect from the Cincinnati Bengals backfield in 2024 fantasy football? What does a Bengals backfield without Joe Mixon look like? Luckily, we do have some data that we can lean on. In fact, again, we were literally just talking about this yesterday in Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's Discord server. You got to join us using that link we left for you in the show notes. You will not regret it. There's league-wrecking fantasy football insights every single day inside there. There were 10 games in 2020 that Joe Mixon missed, giving us pretty extensive data as to how Zach Taylor approaches a Cincinnati Bengals backfield without Joe Mixon. Over those 10 games, Giovanni Bernard acted as the team's number 1 running back, and he averaged 14 plus touches and 12 plus PPR points per game, while Samaje Perine acted as the team's number 2 running back and averaged over 7 touches and 6 points per game. Heading into week 1 of 2024, I am projecting Zack Moss for anywhere between 12 and 16 touches per game, at least to start the season, and Chase Brown for anywhere between 9 and 13 touches per game. And those numbers, the levers on those numbers could shift as the season wears on. For what it's worth, I mentioned that I'm projecting Zack Moss for anywhere between 12 and 16 touches per game to start the season, and we do have a 14-game sample size of Zack Moss landing between 12 and 16 touches. During those 14 games, he averaged 13.4 touches and 11.9 PPR points per game. If you really want to go there, 11.9 PPR points per game last year over a 17-game season, that would have been good enough for an RB18 finish. But it's rare these days for a running back to actually play all 17 games. In fact, of the top 18 fantasy football running backs in 2023, only 9 of them played 17 games. So we really shouldn't be expecting an RB18 season from Zack Moss, but it's still at least helpful to know that on average, he's getting you nearly 12 PPR points per game when he's landing in that 12 to 16 touch window. Still, in those games where Zack Moss does get 12 to 16 touches, he finishes with fewer than 10 PPR points more frequently than he scores more than 15 PPR points. And it's also worth noting that as of right now, as of this recording, Zack Moss's current over-under for rushing yards on BetOnline is just 725.5 rushing yards in 2024. That would have been good. That would have ranked 31st among all running backs in 2023. Ultimately, this entire situation profiles as one that's going to be an ugly running back by committee, where more often than not, both running backs in the offense are going to frustrate their fantasy football managers. Zack Moss's best approach as a touchdown or bust, lower end RB2/RB3 flex, while Chase Brown is going to hang out on that RB3/4 flex type of line to start the season, with some upside if he can start to work ahead of Zack Moss. Of course, the reverse is true as well. If either guy can start to separate from the other one, then maybe we can see a little bit of upside in fantasy football. In fact, where the biggest difference between Zack Moss and Chase Brown can be felt in 2024 fantasy football is if one of them is able to 100% inherit Joe Mixon's goal line role. Joe Mixon finished with the 3rd or 4th most running back targets inside the 5-yard line in each of the last 3 seasons. He finished with the 3rd or 4th most rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line in each of the last 3 seasons. And he's handled 93.8% or more of the Cincinnati Bengals rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line in each of the last 3 seasons. If Zack Moss or Chase Brown can inherit that role full-time, that is where we can finally start to see a noteworthy difference for 2024 fantasy football. So, after all of that, after I said I was going to keep it short on the Bengals backfield, and then I'm pretty sure I just went for 10 minutes on Zack Moss and Chase Brown. But after all of that, the question is, do we smash or pass on these guys at their respective costs in 2024 fantasy football drafts. Growing up, one of my favorite things to do was play Madden on my PlayStation, PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5. And when I say play Madden, what I really mean is simulate the games and simulate the seasons, because my favorite part was managing the team, scouting prospects, doing the draft, making trades, signing free agents, and everything that goes into managing a football team and leading a franchise to glory, building it from the ground up. And if that's your type of deal, if you love that sort of thing, you're going to absolutely love GM Dynasty, which is a simulated football game that I recently started playing and instantly fell in love with. With realistic game planning mechanics and immersive features, GM Dynasty puts you in the hot seat of sports management. And it's not just a game, it's a simulation of the real deal. I invite you to get your free team and compete in Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's upcoming tournament, where there's going to be prizes for whoever wins the thing. Register your account on gmdynasty.com, and when you do, join the Basement Brewed Fantasy Football contest using the link that we left for you in the show notes. Zack Moss is currently Fantasy's RB24 around pick 90, mid 8th round pick. Chase Brown is currently Fantasy's RB36 around pick 119 overall, late 10th round pick. Do we smash or pass at those costs? The cost for both guys is completely fine, right? Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide, we currently have Zack Moss ranked 92nd overall, which is right near his current ADP of 90 overall. We have Chase Brown ranked 117 overall, which is right near his 119 overall. So the cost is completely fine, but it's a matter of the options that surround both guys. And in Zack Moss's case, when I have an opportunity to draft him in the 7th, 8th, 9th round, I'm instead usually opting for one of the other running backs that are near him, like Ramondre Stevenson, Aaron Jones, DeAndre Swift, Zamir White, Jalen Warren, Najee Harris, James Conner, Jonathan Brooks, Raheem Mostert. You can also grab a wide receiver like Curtis Samuel. You can get your QB1 like Joe Burrow or Dak Prescott. And then in Chase Brown's case, again, his cost is completely fine, but I'd rather take one of the other running backs near him like Austin Eckler, Gus Edwards, or Ezekiel Elliott. I'd rather grab a tight end like Dallas Goedert if I haven't grabbed my tight end yet. I'd like a wide receiver like Mike Williams, who's arguably one of the biggest steals in fantasy football, but we'll get to that when it's time. I like Jerry Jeudy. If I don't have a quarterback yet, I like to grab somebody like Brock Purdy. Otherwise, you can still get Trevor Lawrence, Jared Goff, Tua Tagovailoa. When it comes down to it, when push comes to shove, more often than not, 9 times out of 10, I am passing on both Zack Moss and Chase Brown in 2024 fantasy football. Their cost is completely fine, but the upside is just not there compared to the other options that are available in their respective ranges. Whew. All right, let's move on. Let's talk Cincinnati's 3rd round pick, their 80th overall pick in this year's draft, Jermaine Burton, wide receiver from Alabama. He's currently being drafted as Fantasy's wide receiver 66 around pick 144 overall, which is right at the turn of the 12th to 13th round. Do we smash or pass on Jermaine Burton at his current cost on drafters.com? Now, if you're not familiar with Jermaine Burton, no worries. He is a solid prospect from both a college production and a film analysis standpoint. In fact, rookie scout and film guru John Chapman called Jermaine Burton a big play waiting to happen, albeit not necessarily the best route runner in this year's draft class, but he is a solid prospect. He's a big play waiting to happen, and he does have pretty solid draft capital on his side, being the 80th overall pick, being a 3rd round pick for the Cincinnati Bengals. And now, with Tyler Boyd out the door, Jermaine Burton has a legitimate shot to land the wide receiver 3 role in a Joe Burrow offense. And that's one that has been fruitful in fantasy football over the last several years. In fact, again, we just talked about this in Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's Discord server the other day. I'm telling you guys, there is league-wrecking fantasy football insights dropped daily in that Discord server. You gotta join us using the link that we left for you in the show notes. But in 32 full games that Tyler Boyd played with Joe Mixon, plus Jamarr Chase, plus T. Higgins over the last few years, Tyler Boyd averaged 11.4 points per game. That's not bad at all. In fact, for context, 11.4 PPR points per game over 17 games last season would have been good for a wide receiver 34 finish. That's wide receiver 3 production in fantasy football. Tyler Boyd has had a decent floor, even with T. Higgins and Jamarr Chase in town. He most frequently landed between 10 and 15 PPR points. He did so in 13 of 32 games, or about 41% of the time. He offered standalone upside. He offered the occasional spiked week, scoring 15 or more PPR points in 7 of 32 games with both T. Higgins and Jamarr Chase. He had 4 games over 20 PPR points, including a high of 29.5 PPR points in games where T. Higgins and Jamarr Chase were active. And of course, in 21 games with Joe Burrow, but not T. Higgins and or Jamarr Chase, the upside went through the roof. Tyler Boyd averaged over 13 PPR points and nearly 8 targets per game in opportunities that he got without T. Higgins or Jamarr Chase siphoning targets. That wide receiver 3 role in Joe Burrow's offense, it's been a fruitful one. Tyler Boyd was Fantasy's wide receiver 31 in 2021 and Fantasy's wide receiver 38 in 2022. That's wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4 flex production in the 2 seasons where Joe Burrow has played every single game, and he had Jamarr Chase and T. Higgins operating as his wide receiver 1s and wide receiver 2. That wide receiver 3 role in Cincinnati, it's one to know and one to target in fantasy football. Of course, at this point, it's no sure thing that Jermaine Burton is the team's wide receiver 3 come week 1. And that's something where you need to keep it locked on to Basement Brewed Fantasy Football. You need to keep it locked on the channel and pay attention to training camp reports to see who's getting the most run as the Bengals wide receiver 3, at least to start the season. They still have 6th-year man Trenton Irwin, who they like, who's done well when given the chance. In fact, as a quick best ball note, Trenton Irwin should probably be drafted higher than he is in best ball leagues. They also have Charlie Jones, who they drafted in the 4th round last year. They drafted Andre Iosivas. I always say it wrong, but they drafted him in the 6th round. There is some competition for targets in that wide receiver 3 role. And one of my favorite sneaky bets to steal looks as the 3rd option in the Bengals passing attack is Mike Gesicki, who we're going to talk about in just 1 second. But as for Jermaine Burton, he is an absolute smash at his current cost, absolutely worthy of a late round flyer for a guy who's being drafted as Fantasy's wide receiver 66 around pick 144 at the 12th and 13th round turn. Happy to take a flyer on Jermaine Burton at that cost. Last but not least, sorry Tanner, I promise we're wrapping it up here pretty quickly, but last but not least, let's talk about free agent tight end Mike Gesicki. Are we smashing or passing on Mike Gesicki at his current cost of tight end 30 around pick 219, which is in the early 19th round? Now, it's easy to forget considering recent struggles over the last 2 seasons, but Mike Gesicki has been a fantasy-friendly tight end before. In 45 games with the Dolphins between 2019 and 2021, Mike Gesicki averaged over 10 PPR points and 6 targets per game in those 45 contests. He finished as the number 12 tight end in 2019. He was the number 7 tight end in 2020, and he was the number 8 tight end in 2021. Of course, he was not used in Mike McDaniel's offense in 2022. He was Fantasy's number 22 tight end that year. He was not used in the Patriots offense in 2023 when he finished as tight end 36. He averaged just 4.8 PPR points and 2.8 targets per game in 34 games since those magical seasons that ended in 2021. Still, he's joining a Joe Burrow offense that is lacking a number 3 option in the passing game, a role where Tyler Boyd averaged 11.4 PPR points and nearly 6 targets per game in 32 games with Jamarr Chase, Joe Burrow, and T. Higgins. Somebody needs to step up and take that number 3 wide receiver role, and Mike Gesicki is more than capable of filling in as a type of big slot type of tight end. He is a very sneaky bet in 2024 fantasy football leagues. But again, he's going to compete with Jermaine Burton, the 3rd round pick, Trenton Irwin, Charlie Jones, Andre Iosivas. I think I said it right that time. And for what it's worth, in 13 games that Hayden Hurst played with the Bengals in 2022, the best tight end that Joe Burrow has had in his career, he averaged 8.1 PPR points per game over those 13 games. That is a rate that would have made him fantasy's number 13 tight end had he just played all 17 games. Gesicki is a very sneaky bet in 2024. Now, to be clear, he should not be anywhere near your radar in fantasy football drafts in a normal-sized fantasy football league. But in a best ball league, he's a high-end tight end 3 with some upside, and he absolutely should put on some streaming performances in 2024 fantasy football. I love him as an absolute smash at his current cost, which is basically free. Tight end 30, pick 219, early 19th round pick. Looking at Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's draft guide, Mike Gesicki currently sits at pick 207 overall, which is well ahead of his 219 ADP. He's a smash as a high-end tight end 3 in your best ball leagues. Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's 2024 draft guide is a resource that BBFF subscribers are using to dominate their drafts and get ahead of their league mates before that first football is even kicked in week 1. It contains 300 players, and it's complete with rankings that are going to help with tough decisions, tiers that help you plan for future draft picks, 2024 analysis and previews for all 300 players, stoplights that suggest the perfect time to draft a player, wait for a player, or reach for a player that you absolutely must have on your roster, and an ADP tracker that shows you which direction a player is trending in real drafts over the last several weeks. The draft guide is built and maintained with 30 plus hours of weekly research and over 300 real drafts done by yours truly. It's like you're walking into your fantasy draft having done 300 of your own to prepare. It's $14.99 per year, and you can find it using the link that we left for you in the show notes. That's all for today. I will see you on the fantasy football field, and I hope to see you in the basement. Basement Brewed Fantasy Football's Discord server filled with sharp fantasy football brains that are dedicated to helping each other out. Join us using the link that we left for you in the show notes. Talk to you soon.